Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt, and the focus is Commander-in-Chief. Year is 1941. It's December. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Franklin Roosevelt has gotten a declaration of war not only against the Japanese, but also against the Germans and the Italians. But he realized not only was he now the commander-in-chief of the armed forces at a time of war, he was also the country's communicator-in-chief. He never forgot this role, a key piece of leading and uniting and rallying around the country for a total effort to win this war. Roosevelt spoke on December the 9th to the American people in a fireside chat. We are now in this war. We are all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking in American history. We must share together the bad news and the good news, the defeats and the victories, the changing fortunes of war. He continued in his outreach in his State of the Union address, which came just a couple of weeks later when he talked about the objectives for the United States now that they're in the war. Our own objectives are clear. The objective of smashing the militarism imposed by warlords upon their enslaved peoples. The objective of liberating the subjugated nations. The objective of establishing and securing freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear everywhere in the world, what became known as Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. We shall not stop short of these objectives. Roosevelt had to get his military leadership now quickly aligned, and he settled on a team that he was very comfortable with throughout the entire conflict. In the Army Chief of Staff, you had General George Marshall. Ernest King became the Chief of Naval Operations. Harold Hap Arnold took over the role as the leader for the Army Air Corps. And William Leahy, who had known Roosevelt actually for quite some time, Naval Admiral who had actually been serving recently as the U.S. ambassador to the Vichy government in France. Roosevelt brought him back to take on the role of Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, what we would call now the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. Leahy would work out of the White House very closely with Roosevelt. Well, for Pearl Harbor, a lot of sadness, but if there was one person who was actually kind of happy about Pearl Harbor, it was Winston Churchill. Why? Well, not the loss of American lives, but the fact that the Americans were finally getting in the war, something that he had been sort of pushing for quite some time. Well, now that war had been declared, he wanted to get with Roosevelt and start planning together immediately. He came to the United States, came to Washington, D.C., planned to stay for about a week. He moved into the White House for about a month, got really close, very comfortable with Franklin Roosevelt. He wrote a letter back home to Clement Attlee, and he said, "We live here as a big family, in the greatest intimacy and informality, and I have formed the very highest regard and admiration for the President. His breadth of view, resolution, and his loyalty to the common cause are beyond all praise." Churchill actually spoke to a joint session of Congress, the first foreigner to do that in about a century, since the Marquis de Lafayette had done it back in the early 19th century. He left that gathering waving his V sign for victory. He and Roosevelt, again, very close, very fast in these informal settings, but on very serious topics during his month in the White House. Some of the things they decided: a command structure, a joint command structure that would be based in Washington, D.C., that would also have with it a combined munitions assignment board, critical to prioritizing the production and deployment of resources. As for money, well, in this case, no object. That whole idea about Roosevelt wanting a balanced budget, that is far away now, gone from the scene. In 1940, the Americans had spent about $2.6 billion on defense. In 41, it went up to $6 billion. By 42, now that they're in the war, $18 billion. The following 3 years, the last 3 years of the war, the Americans would average about $40 billion in defense spending per year. The Depression, it was over. Full employment had returned now that the Americans were at war. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill agreed that Germany would be the first priority. And most of the Americans were really upset, obviously, with Japan for the attack on Pearl Harbor. But Roosevelt agreed with Churchill that the greater threat to humanity was Adolf Hitler and Germany. So that would be the priority. But in the meantime, they had to figure out also what to do with the Japanese. Chester Nimitz was placed in charge of the Pacific Fleet, and he had to observe the Japanese taking over lots of the South Pacific: Hong Kong, Guam, the Wake Islands, the Solomon Islands, the Gilbert Islands, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. Soon British Singapore would be under the gun and under the control of the Japanese, as would be the Philippines, owned of course by the Americans, and where Douglas MacArthur had been placed in command by President Roosevelt. Well, they were all overrun by the Japanese, including MacArthur in the Philippines. He took his men to the Bataan Peninsula on the island of Corregidor. Weeks of relentless bombing by the Japanese. Eventually they realized they couldn't hold out much longer, and Roosevelt, to preserve MacArthur, personally actually ordered him to escape through the Japanese blockade, which he agreed to do. He set up his headquarters in Australia, while Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright eventually surrendered 76,000 men to the Japanese in the Philippines. They then were marched on the famous Bataan Death March, in which many Americans were died along the way. One of MacArthur's things: I will return to the Philippines. He was bound and determined to get back there and rescue all of these people who had been captured. Roosevelt wanted to send another message to the Japanese, and that was a question: what could he do? Well, how about bombing Tokyo? Was this even possible? Well, they came up with a plan where, sure enough, they could fly some bombers off of a carrier, get close enough, drop some bombs on Tokyo, and then fly over China, an American ally, where they would parachute out and then sort of hope for the best. And for this, they asked for volunteers, and the leader was a lieutenant colonel by the name of James Doolittle. 80 airmen volunteered for this mission, going onto 16 different planes that were reconfigured to do maximum fuel. Then they got out to where they thought would be about 650 miles distance was the plan, but then they spotted some Japanese patrols, so at 800 miles away from Tokyo, they decided to launch. Again, they knew they had enough fuel to get to Tokyo, drop their payload, which is what they did. Whether or not they would be able to get into the territory of China and be able to be free when they jumped out, that was a question. Throughout all of this remarkable experience, 71 of those 80 airmen did come back alive, as the practical damage in Tokyo was actually kind of minimal, but the morale factor, both in terms of the Japanese psyche as well as those of the Americans and the Allies, a major impact from what Doolittle did and his team. Franklin Roosevelt awarded him with the Medal of Honor. Tokyo is about 7,000 miles away from Washington, D.C., but some of the concerns for the Americans were actually much closer to home, the U.S. West Coast. This was a potential target for a Japanese attack and was also home to thousands of people of Japanese descent, many of whom were U.S. citizens, but there was a concern, well, maybe there are spies in this group, maybe people actually acting on behalf of the Japanese, and some in the Army thought something should be done about this. Well, in the first month of the war, we take a step back for a moment, because Roosevelt spoke on the 150th anniversary of the Bill of Rights about kind of what they were fighting for here in World War II. Roosevelt had said, what we face is nothing more or less than an attempt to overthrow and to cancel out the great upsurge of human liberty, of which the American Bill of Rights is the fundamental document. But we Americans know that the determination of this generation of our people to preserve liberty is as fixed and certain as the determination of that earlier generation of Americans to win it. We will not, under any threat or in the face of any danger, surrender the guarantees of liberty our forefathers framed for us in the Bill of Rights. Well, then came along a recommendation from the War Department. War Secretary Henry Stimson and Assistant Secretary John McCloy, who was in charge of domestic security and pretty influential, and he had actually kind of little regard for the Constitution. McCloy said, if it's a question of safety of the country or the Constitution of the United States, well, the Constitution is just a scrap of paper to me. Well, Roosevelt had just talked about securing the Bill of Rights as a foundational pledge here associated with this military operation called World War II. But he decided to go along with the recommendation from his War Department to sign Executive Order 9066, February 19th, 1942, an exclusionary document that said the following. According to this, whereas the successful prosecution of the war requires every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage to national defense material, national defense premises, and national defense utilities, I hereby authorize and direct the Secretary of War to prescribe military areas in such places and of such extent from which any or all persons may be excluded. Excluded, in this case, was almost entirely applied to people of Japanese descent living on the West Coast. They were immediately rounded up en masse. forced to sell all of their belongings, basically at fire sale prices. They were bused to temporary assembly stations and then taken to one of 10 camps, away from the coast, behind barbed wire, behind armed guards. About 120,000 people were put into these camps. About 2/3 of them were American citizens. There were no charges, no trials, basically imprisoned for the duration of the war. Thinking about the Bill of Rights, well, these moves could be seen to potentially be violating Bill of Rights Amendments number 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 8. What about the Supreme Court? Would they tolerate this? Well, it was challenged. A 23-year-old by the name of Fred Korematsu had been arrested as part of the rounding up of the people of Japanese descent. His case eventually made it to the Supreme Court. 1944, the ruling came down 6-3 in favor of the government. Hugo Black, a former Klansman, wrote in favor of the court, "We are not unmindful of the hardships imposed by it upon a large group of American citizens, but hardships are part of war, and war is an aggregation of hardships." There were 3 strong dissents in the Korematsu case, including one from Frank Murphy. Murphy wrote that, "I dissent therefore from the legalization of racism. Racial discrimination in any form and in any degree has no justifiable part whatever in our democratic way of life. They, all residents, must accordingly be treated at all times as the heirs of the American experiment and as entitled to all the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution, but not people of Japanese descent at the outset of World War II and for the duration of World War II. 40 years later, another American court, a federal court, actually repudiated the Korematsu decision, writing in the 1980s, "Fortunately, there are few instances in our judicial history when courts have been called upon to undo such profound and publicly acknowledged injustice. Congress authorized some reparations for people who had been through the camps, but one thing for sure, they would never get back those 3 years of their lives." Let's turn back to the Pacific, where a key battle was now right around the corner. Military intelligence had kind of been a failure at Pearl Harbor, but that would not be the case in the Battle of Midway, where the American intel folks actually figured out exactly what the Japanese were planning. Midway was critical. If the Americans had it, it could potentially be that launching path on the way to the Japanese homeland. If the Japanese had it, well, that would open up the path to both Pearl Harbor and potentially the American West Coast. That's what Admiral Yamamoto, the head of the combined fleet for the Japanese, had in mind when in early June 1942, he sent 4 carriers on its way to attack and capture Midway. But the Americans knew they were coming, the date, the time. They decided to put 3 of their own carriers in there to defend. Well, Admiral Yamamoto had launched his initial wave of bombers, and when they came back, the man in charge of the execution of this mission, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had a decision to actually change armaments after that first wave came back. And this actually created some chaos kind of on the deck of the aircraft carriers, and it gave an opening to the Americans who were searching for these carriers of the Japanese. They found them. They sunk them. 3 were sunk by the Americans. 1 more was so badly damaged that the Japanese scuttled it. The Americans did lose 1 aircraft carrier of their own, but the Japanese lost over 300 airplanes in this. Look, the Americans were still going to have a very long, difficult slog to try to get to Japan and force them into capitulation, because the Japanese basically went into World War II with this mindset that no one was ever going to surrender. But the damage done to the fleet at Midway for the Japanese ultimately was insurmountable. They were not able to come back from this. They were playing defense pretty much for the rest of the war, as the Americans now were able to go on the offense, island to island, on the way to the Japanese homeland. In Europe, Roosevelt is anxious to get troops on the ground and demonstrate that we're in this war, we're fighting hand in hand. The Germans actually, or rather the Americans were focusing on, well, let's have a cross-channel invasion of France, take on France, return that to the French people, and then move on to Germany. That's what General Marshall wanted to do. But the British were against this. They said it was going to be too costly, and actually we weren't ready for it. Maybe eventually we could do this, but not yet. So Winston Churchill actually told Roosevelt, no responsible British general, admiral, or air marshal is prepared to recommend the crossing as a practical operation in 1942, at least not yet. They agreed that initially they would go to North Africa, where the Germans were already sort of entrenched under Irwin Rommel, kind of going after the Mideast oil. That was sort of the gold mine within the North Africa area. And Roosevelt agreed with Churchill that they would land American troops on the ground in North Africa. Dwight Eisenhower, the general, was put in charge of this with 200,000 American troops landing in 3 different locations. The plan was to form up with British General Bernard Montgomery and kick the Germans out of North Africa. In the middle of this fight, Roosevelt wanted to visit, and he actually met Churchill in Casablanca within the sort of the zone of the fight. They wanted Stalin to join them, but Stalin was saying, look, my country's under attack. I'm not leaving my soil right now. And besides, Stalin was not very happy. He wanted that cross-channel invasion by the Allies to create a second front and take some of the pressure off of what was going on in Russia. And again, Roosevelt and Churchill met. They said, we're not ready for that cross-channel landing at this point. What are we going to do for Stalin? Well, we'll send him some more munitions, some more aid, kind of a sop to him, and let him know the cross-channel assault will be coming. It's just not here yet. At the end of the conference in Casablanca, Roosevelt, almost off the cuff, offered this line: the elimination of German, Japanese, and Italian war power means the unconditional surrender by Germany, Italy, and Japan. That had been the first time those words, unconditional surrender, had been uttered by any of the policy leaders. Winston Churchill was taken aback initially about this, but he basically agreed. That was the only way they were going to get to victory, and he was perfectly aligned with Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt also needed help. His entire focus now is sort of on the war, looking across overseas, but he still had a country to run. So he stood up the Office of War Mobilization, broad authority over the domestic economy, and he went to the Supreme Court, James Byrnes, who he had just placed on the court about a year before, and said, look, I need you to step down and run this Office of War Mobilization. In fact, your decision is my decision, and there is no appeal. For all practical purposes, you will be assistant president. Well, Byrnes agreed to do this, and we cannot underestimate the importance of American production in the victory in World War II. 300,000 planes, 72,000 ships of all sizes, 86,000 tanks, 8.5 million rifles, 14 tons of ammunition and bombs. All of this was produced by the Americans, not to mention the Manhattan Project, which we'll get back to in a future episodes. Byrnes was critical, playing that role, enabling all of this production on behalf of his Commander-in-Chief. That's Franklin Roosevelt and Commander-in-Chief from the life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.